there's some space on what he's distributing. I sent him the notes last night. He said, well, get them to me by midnight, and I'll be able to give copies to everybody. So I got them to him by about 11:30, but it was 12 pages of packed notes, and so he has very kindly condensed that for you. But the long version is up on a website, so he'll provide that link to you, and you can go and look at that if you like. I was very glad when he asked me to come and give this talk, because as a teacher at Western Michigan University, I see students come through whose faith has been shaken, really rocked by the various kinds of attacks that they get. And I thought of this verse as a kind of epigraph for today's talk from 2 Peter 3:16. There are some things in them. He's speaking of the epistles of Paul here, but the principle applies to all of Scripture, that are hard to understand, which the ignorant and unstable twist to their own destruction, as they do the other Scriptures. I think we'll see some examples of that today. Here's a little map that I like to use to talk about where we are in talking about the material. The defense of the faith has got both a positive side and a defensive or negative side. On the positive side, we offer evidence for the truth of Christianity. External evidence, historical evidence, archaeological evidence, the evidence of the intersection of the New Testament documents, for example, with other historians like Josephus or Tacitus. And an internal side. There are internal marks of authenticity in the New Testament documents. I'm going to stick with the New Testament today. All of this can also be said of the Old Testament, but we have to limit our field because there's so much to talk about. But then there are the objections, and there are two basic classes of objections to the Gospels and Acts. One class of objections is they just get things wrong. Historically, they make mistakes, and here's how you can tell that they make mistakes, because Josephus says this, but Luke says that. And that's a whole talk in its own right. In fact, that's two whole talks. And then there's the internal criticism that if you take the gospel narratives themselves, well, they don't fit together properly. There are places where one of them says A and the other says B. And since we know that that can't be right, something must have gone wrong. Smart people have done their best to attack Scripture. So the attacks can't all just be brushed aside by saying, oh, well, you know, whatever, or I'm sure that's wrong. I actually know a young woman who was an adult convert. She came to Christ late in high school. And one of the first things she did was to go to a local library and start looking for books about Jesus. She was very excited about Jesus. That makes sense. And she found a book by a New Testament critic, who I think Dr. Wielhouwer has mentioned, named Bart Ehrman. And it was full of claims that, oh, the Gospels contradict each other all over the place. And she was so shocked by what she was reading that she closed the book and she put it back on the library shelf. And then she went on for a couple of years just sort of holding that nervousness in her mind, not knowing quite what to say. When she finally told me that this was something that had been bothering her, I said, no, go get the book. I also have a copy. Mine is all marked up. And we're going to meet every week and open it anywhere, ask anything. But we're going to go through these until you are personally persuaded that there is nothing to it. And over the course of a month and a half or so, we did that, and it was just wonderful to see the change in her as she began reading these things and saying, okay, first step, we're going to actually go read the text for ourselves, and often that's all it took. But we'll talk about some of those alleged contradictions today. Big picture on answering objections. The Bible's a big book. There are thousands of objections that can be raised against it. How many of you did sort of boop around a little on the internet and look at stuff? Did you find some of these websites, Skeptics Annotated Bible, or 194 Contradictions in the Gospels, or things like that? It's all over. These things are very popular, and you can't avoid them. You won't be able to avoid them. You may say you're personally, completely confident you have no worries. That's fine. Any of you hope to get married? That's what, a couple dozen spouses? You got to guarantee that none of those people will ever have any questions? Got any brothers, sisters, cousins, friends at church? There are people with questions. There are probably people with questions sitting in this room. And that's okay. What's not okay is not to answer the questions. Sometimes we'll run into questions and we don't know at the moment how to answer them. There's good news. This also happens with respect to secular history. Questions we have, we're not sure how to answer them. Nobody says, well, Ulysses Grant wrote Memoirs of the Civil War and he never mentions the Emancipation Proclamation, so maybe Abraham Lincoln didn't exist. Nobody says that. We all know that whatever the reasons for Grant's silence about that event, it doesn't undermine the big picture. Learning to live with your own limitations, your own lack of knowledge, is important. However, there's nothing wrong in attempting to answer these to the best of our ability. So that's what we'll be doing today. I want to take a minute just to stress something. There's a fallacy that the Oxford logician Richard Whately calls the fallacy of objections. Here's what it is. Somebody throws some question at you, right? Well, how come the Old Testament says that two different people killed Goliath? It says that David killed Goliath and it says that Elhanan killed Goliath. Which way was it? And you haven't been reading around in 2 Samuel and Chronicles for a long time, and so it leaves you completely flummoxed. You don't know what to say. Here's the error. Getting so fixated on that one objection that you can't answer that you forget that there are a lot of objections to the position that Christianity is false. Rationally, what you want to do is not to be super scholar and eliminate all objections. They'll keep coming. There are enough objections out there. People can cut and paste and email them to you until you're both dead. The reasonable thing to do is to take the side where the fewest objections lie. And it does take an awful lot of faith, in a certain debased sense of the word, to be an atheist. My friend Frank Turek has actually written a book called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. Any of you seen that book? Have a look. Check it out. It's a good read. So here's a common view of the New Testament. The gentleman that you see on your right is one of the so-called new atheists, Christopher Hitchens. The New Testament, he tells us, is a work of crude carpentry, hammered together long after its purported events and full of improvised attempts to make things come out right. Since writing that, Hitchens has gone to meet his maker, and presumably he knows a bit better now. But that is a common view, and if you go to university, odds are your professors will assume that. Well, of course, don't we all know that? Don't assume that your professors always know what they're talking about. I'll tell you a cautionary tale here. A couple of years ago, I was printing off a paper in the printing room at my department, and one of my colleagues, an extremely smart guy, PhD from a highly ranked school, said to me, "Oh, well, what are you reading?" And I said, "It's a paper on the four Gospels." And he looked at me. You got to remember, extremely educated, very smart guy. He just looked at me and he said, "The four Gospels? Never heard of them." And yet he discussed the existence of God in his philosophy classes. Negatively, I need not say. And so don't assume that everybody out there is just prepared to the max with incredible arguments you've never heard before. Actually, there's a lot of ignorance out there. Now, that's not a reason for you to get cocky, but it is a reason for you to be a little bit more relaxed when you hear somebody just rounding off and attacking Christianity. Here's Bart Ehrman. He's speaking of the resurrection narratives, but in his other books, he goes after the entire New Testament. The sources, he says, are hopelessly contradictory, as we can see by doing a detailed comparison of the accounts in the Gospels. This is from his work on the historical Jesus. So I decided that I would follow a number of criticisms that Bart Ehrman has laid out and see just how much comes of them. But before we do that, let's just review our goals. First of all, I want to help us to understand the difference between a real contradiction and an apparent contradiction. We need that because there are going to be a lot of apparent contradictions, and you need to know, all right, what does that mean? Second, we're going to explore some of the methods that historians use to assess apparent contradictions in secular historical work, identifying some common sources of apparent contradictions. People who are studying Tiberius Caesar need to have ways of approaching the texts because they don't all say the same thing. So I want to use a historian's methodology today as we're looking at these documents. see what happens. Third, in the light of those methods, to examine a few of the most common charges of contradiction among the Gospels. There are more. I have an entire separate lecture. You're going to think this lecture goes really long. And that's okay. I have an entire separate one that's like part 2, where I go over 9 more. So there's lots of them out there. We'll look at some of the most common ones. And finally, to assess that accusation that the Gospels are hopelessly contradictory. So when we're done, I hope that you'll have something to say about that. Here's what we won't do this morning. We will not prove that the Bible is inspired or that it is inerrant. That's not a historian's job. Historical research can't establish those conclusions. It can clear the ground for considering them, though. After all, if you look at a book and it contradicts itself left and right, you may be disinclined even to take seriously the question, well, is it inspired by God? No, obviously not. Look at all these contradictions and errors. So the first thing that good historical research can do is to help us to sort of clear the way for consideration of those other and very important topics. Second, I'm not going to try to resolve all of the alleged contradictions in the Gospels. Just look at some of the most common ones. Here's why I'm not going to try. This brilliant graphic put up by some atheists is a chart of 439 alleged contradictions. Every red arc here goes from some verse over to some other verse. Isn't that impressive? I mean, where there's that many red lines, you just look at it and go, wow. I read stuff like this for devotions. Because once you actually get down below the stunning graphic, if I were to erase all but 6 of those arcs, and then we were to look at all 6 of them and say, nah, nothing here, that wouldn't look nearly as impressive, right? So they're trying to snow you, to hit you with so much at once that you just fold. You say, I couldn't answer 439. Yeah, actually, you probably could. But let's not be overwhelmed by the fact that 439 objections, 98% of them so bad that simply reading the text and having normal common sense would dissolve them. It's not that hard, actually. You can do it. But let's start with an example of an actual contradiction. Last year, the science fiction author Ray Bradbury died. Here are verbatim quotations from 3 news stories. Number 1, legendary science fiction author Ray Bradbury passed away Wednesday morning in Los Angeles. That seems pretty straightforward. Number 2, Bradbury's daughter confirmed his death to the Associated Press on Wednesday morning. She said her father died Tuesday night in Southern California. See the problem? Was it Wednesday morning or was it Tuesday night? Third one, Bradbury died Tuesday night in Los Angeles. His agent, Michael Condon, confirmed. Well now, there's the big picture and there are the details. They differ regarding the day of Bradbury's death by 1 day. One of them gives a less specific location, Southern California versus Los Angeles. But what do they all agree on? Ray Bradbury has just died. So the minor divergences in detail don't affect the big picture. Historians are concerned about things that damage the big picture. They usually don't get too head up about a small variation like this, which we get in honest news reports, even where the people have lots of information, right? They can go online and catch the AP Wire story. Even so, historians say, you know, we could quibble about whether it was Tuesday or Wednesday, but obviously the guy's just died. No doubt about that. So from an historian's point of view, the very first thing you want to ask is, in any set of documents, are the discrepancies serious enough that they damage the big picture? If they're not, then we can have an interesting discussion about them, but the big picture remains in place. We expect that independent accounts will have apparent and even real contradictions in many of the details. If you want, somebody asked me about this later, the accounts that we've got from various sources, Plutarch, Diocasius, etc., of the death of Julius Caesar, differ from one another wildly. They don't even get the name of the first conspirator to approach and kill Caesar. Remember Caesar getting stabbed in the Forum? Maybe you've seen Shakespeare's play about this. They can't even get his name right. There are 4 different names for the first conspirator to stab Caesar. What? How did that happen? You know what? The headline remains, Caesar assassinated in the Forum. Now, if the contradictions were real, not just apparent, and if they were so extensive that they really undermined the credibility of our sources, then we'd have a problem. So I've been using this word contradiction. Let's get a definition down. 2 claims contradict one another when one of them must be false if the other is true. At least one of the 2 claims must be mistaken. If I say my oldest daughter's name is Bethel and I say my oldest daughter's name is Clara, then unless something very interesting is going on, which isn't common in our culture, that is having multiple names for the same person, I've contradicted myself. Apparent contradictions seem that they cannot both be true. And maybe they can't, but maybe they can. There are 5 sources of apparent contradiction. One is just carelessness, interpreting a phrase or a sentence without regard to genre or narrative context. Anytime somebody tells you, well, here's a contradiction, first step should be get your Bible, open it up, and read the passage for yourself. Over half the time, that'll take care of it. Just read it. You don't have to be a specialist. You don't have to know Greek. You don't have to know Hebrew. You don't have to have a background in archaeology. You don't have to go to seminary. Read it, and that'll clear it. So this is your first line of defense. Keep it handy. Don't allow somebody else to tell you what the text says. We'll see an example of this as we go forward. Second, completeness. The assumption that the purpose of every narrative is to tell me absolutely everything. Because we live in an information-saturated society where you can just go online and, you and Google, right? You're a team. You can look stuff up. It's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that ancient historical writers intended to give you the complete biography, as if they were following Jesus around with camcorders and trying to make sure that every single word he said got captured in living color. That's not the purpose of the Gospels. The Gospels are good news. Yes, they give you, by the standards of the time, biographical information. They conform to the Greco-Roman biography form, but that form is not an attempt to be comprehensive. It's not even always an attempt to put things in strict chronological order. Sometimes material that's thematically similar will be grouped together all in one place because it's all apocalyptic teaching. Even if Jesus delivered it on 5 or 6 different occasions, it'll be put in one place because it's all on the same theme. From their point of view, if that means mixing up the order somewhat, that's not a problem. It's a different principle of organization. You need to understand that. Third, conflation, treating 2 different events or persons as if they were the same. You might think, well, that's kind of hard to do, right? I'm standing up here talking. None of you is confusing me with Dr. Wielhouwer. You all know the difference between us. But it happens. Be alert for it. Confusion, treating the same event or person as different. This happens a lot with names. And finally, cultural context, ignoring facts about the language and culture of the events or assuming that those are identical to our cultural context today. First century Palestine is an interesting cultural milieu. It's complicated in some ways. It's certainly different from ours. Human nature is much the same, but the specifics of what they would mean by certain expressions need to be investigated. And sometimes the assumption that they would mean what I would mean if I said that needs to be questioned. We'll see examples of that as well. So here's an apparent contradiction. And I'm drawing this from secular history just so you can get the feel of that, so that you can understand that this is something that we run into as historians everywhere. Who made the public proclamation of the Declaration of Independence from the balcony of the old State House in Boston on the morning of July 18th, 1776? Well, we've got sources. The trouble is, our early sources tell us 2 different names. One of them says it was William Greenleaf, High Sheriff of Suffolk County, and the others say that it was Colonel Thomas Crafts. That looks like a contradiction, doesn't it? What would you say? Now, was the Declaration of Independence still written? Yes. Was it read? Yeah, probably. Who read it? Boy, if I didn't give you any more information, you'd be left saying, I don't know. How many of you would say, that looks like a contradiction? It does. It appears to be a contradiction. Now here's the further information that resolves it. Both accounts are true. Greenleaf had a weak voice, and there was a big crowd. They couldn't hear him. So Colonel Crafts came up and stood beside him, and Greenleaf read the Declaration of Independence one sentence at a time, and then Crafts, with a loud voice, read it out again so everyone could hear it. Funny how a little bit of extra information can take something that looks hopeless and resolve it. If we didn't have that extra bit of information, we might be tempted to say, well, somebody must have gotten it wrong, but we don't know who. But the extra bit of information actually beautifully resolves the appearance of contradiction. There's something about the context of the event that we didn't know until we brought in that extra piece. Does that make sense? All right, I'm going to give you another one. It's a curious case of Jonathan Edwards, two different biographies of Jonathan Edwards. They tell the story of the life of a minister, Jonathan Edwards, son and grandson of a minister. He was precocious. Before he was 10 years old, he was really obviously a genius, famous for his intellectual attainments and his religious maturity. He served for 2 years at his college before accepting a pastoral position in the church where his maternal grandfather had been a pastor. But they fell out. There was a doctrinal dispute, and he got dismissed from that church. So he went to a smaller church where he was well loved. And at that church, he turned to scholarship, and he produced several valuable works, and he corresponded with eminent men. Eventually, he was called to the presidency of a prominent college. On the first Sunday of the new year, where he had been called there, he preached on Jeremiah 28:16. This year thou shalt die. And he did. He was in apparent good health, but that year he died in his mid-50s. So far, both books agree. But one of them says he died in 1758, and one of them says he died in 1801. What? Was it a misprint? Hold that thought. Just hold that thought. And we'll come back to that. Okay, now we're going to get to the meat of this. We're going to talk about some alleged contradictions in the Gospels, and I'm going to throw one in that dovetails over into Acts also. Contradiction number one, Matthew and Luke present conflicting genealogies for Jesus. So who were his ancestors? The lists don't agree. Number two, Matthew claims that Jesus was born during the reign of Herod the Great, but Luke claims that Jesus was born during the Census of Quirinius, more than a decade later. 10 years off. How can you get that? Number three, Matthew has Mary and Joseph living in a house in Bethlehem when Jesus was born, while Luke says they were living in Nazareth and traveled to Bethlehem for a census. Hey, it's Christmas time. You will see some talking head on television, maybe on the History Channel, where they're beginning a new round of absolute insanity, masquerading as history. Somebody will bring that up. And they'll just say it like, well, yeah, everybody knows this. So we'll talk about it. Number four, Mark says Jesus had a disciple named Thaddeus, but he doesn't list Judas. Luke lists Judas, but not Thaddeus. What's going on with that? Number five, Matthew says that the centurion, who wanted his servant to be healed, came to Jesus himself, but Luke says that he sent messengers instead of coming himself. Which way is it? 6, in the Synoptic Gospels, the cleansing of the temple comes at the end of Jesus' ministry. Remember when Jesus makes a whip and he drives out the money changers and he turns over the tables? Oh, but in John it comes at the beginning. Well, Jesus' ministry probably spanned more than 3 years, so it can't be both at the beginning and at the end. Can it? What's going on with that? And number 7, this is a favorite. I got asked this 3 times within the span of 1 week a little while ago. Matthew says that Judas hanged himself and the Jewish rulers bought a field with his money. Luke, in the book of Acts, says that Judas bought a field and fell down and died. How many of you have heard at least one of these objections? Yeah. How many of you have heard more than one? This is common stuff. People who are looking for a quick reason to ignore the Bible, because maybe they find it inconvenient in the claims that it makes on them. All they need to do is pop online, and in 2 minutes, they can have a handful of these things, and they can look like instant experts. We have this culture of making instant experts. We do it a couple of ways. One of them is people type something into a search engine. Another way is that you watch a show on television, and wow, after an hour of watching 3 or 4 people talk, suddenly you're an expert too. Or are you? Maybe you've only heard one side of the story. Let's dive into number 1. The genealogies of Jesus. In Matthew, we find his coming to Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called Christ. But in Luke, we find the genealogy. Now, Luke's genealogy goes in reverse order. It starts with Jesus and moves all the way up to Adam. But Luke says Jesus, when he began his ministry, was about 30 years of age, being the son, as it was supposed, of Joseph, the son of Heli, or Eli, depending on your translation, and so on. Well, so what's Joseph's father's name? Jacob? Eli? So here's the objection stated. Apparently, according to Matthew, Joseph's father's name was Jacob. Luke says it was Eli or Heli. The two genealogies diverge widely all the way back to David, where they converge again, but that's 1,000 years. So here's the assumption. Both genealogies are meant to give the ancestry of Joseph, Jesus' father. What if that assumption is false? Let's look a little bit more closely at the genealogy in Luke. Consensus of a great number of scholars is this actually is the genealogy of Mary. The Greek doesn't say the son of Heli. It just says of Heli. The word son appears once, and then it's just of. It's all genitive case. How many of you have had it in Greek? Greek is a great language. Get some. It's fun. It's not hard. The location of that qualifying phrase, who was the son as it was supposed of Joseph, and the omission of the possessive article before Joseph's name, actually are both indications that Joseph isn't part of the descent that's being traced. It was supposed he was the son of his. But now we're back to Jesus, who was of so-and-so, of so-and-so, of so-and-so, of so-and-so. But supposing that's right, there's still an issue. Luke gives a lot more generations. So here's a quotation from Richard Dawkins, certainly no friend of Christianity. Do these people never open the book that they believe is the literal truth? Why don't they notice those glaring contradictions? Shouldn't a literalist worry about the fact that Matthew traces Joseph's descent from King David via 28 intermediate generations, while Luke has 41 generations? What do you think? 41 generations to 28 generations? It seems like an odd mismatch. And you know, he's right. Matthew does skip over some generations. But it's not required that either genealogy should give each link always from father to son. Matthew's purpose is to establish Jesus' legal descent, not to give every step in the descent. Have you ever noticed the way that Matthew 1:1 begins? Any of you have Bibles? You could pull them out. I realize that's a radical thing to say in the biblical worldview class. First verse of the first chapter of the first book of the New Testament. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Are we skipping some generations? See the point? The phrase, the son of, does not mean in the very next generation down, father to son. It means the descendant of, because descent is the important thing from the Jewish point of view. So right there at the beginning of the chapter, Matthew's already using the son of to indicate not necessarily one generation after another, but descent from. But, maybe that's not enough. Second complaint about this. Matthew counts the generations and comes up with 3 groups of 14. How can he be skipping generations if he's counting them. Notice the assumption that's being built in here, which is not Matthew's assumption, that the only purpose of counting the generations is to specify the total number of father-to-son links in the list. Well, okay, you got a better idea? Somebody might say, actually, I kind of think we do. It could be for ease of memorization, so that you have enough links to trace him back to David this way. But also, there's something really cool, right? The book of the generations of Jesus Christ, the son of David. In Hebrew, each consonant carries a numerical value, and the consonants that spell David's name, DVD, because Hebrew is a word that doesn't have vowels written in, they have to be pointed underneath. The values of those letters are 4 and 6 and 4, and if you add them up, what do you come to? You say, that's a little weird. You know what? You don't have to read very much of the Jewish literature before you encounter this over and over and over again. They've even got numerical games called Gematria, where they take the numerical values of different things and they do mathematical manipulations of them, and then up come other things. It might seem like a very strange way to lodge things in your memory. But an Orthodox rabbi will be able to do this with the numerical values of the letters, and he'll do stuff that will dazzle you. It might also baffle you a little bit. This is perfectly in keeping with Jewish practice of using letters of names and counting up the numbers that they sum up to, and having that be some specific, memorable hook for hanging data on. Can I prove that that's what Matthew's doing here? No, I cannot prove it. But it is a plausible conjecture that many scholars think is probably the reason that he grouped 3 sets of 14. David, David, David. This is Jesus, the son of David. Why David? Why does that matter? Who is Jesus according to the Gospel of Matthew? Specifically, what is it that you can't put your finger down at random in a page of Matthew without risking running into a section where he says, what? What's different about the Gospel of Matthew from any of the other Gospels? Anybody know? And this was done that it might be fulfilled by the prophet who said, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Right? It's prophecy. He's the fulfillment of prophecy. He's the Messiah. But the Messiah has to be descended from David. That's part of the prophetic chain coming down. So he's hammering home the fact that Jesus is the son of David. Oh, I've had people ask me this one. How could they possibly have known their ancestry back so far? You're telling me they could go back 1,000 years? We have databases and the Mormon church trying to keep track of all this, and we have trouble tracing our ancestors back 1,000 years. I think Dr. Wielhouwer can trace this back to the Mayflower. Many of us can't even go that far. Mine were some hooligans in Scotland who got kicked out. What can I say? So, how could the Jews have known that? Well, that was much more important to them than it was to us. So we've got the Jewish historian Josephus giving his own ancestry and then saying, so I have set down the genealogy of our family as I have found it described in the public records to put an end to any would-be detractors. And guess how far back he traces it? He traces it all the way back to David. His family was a Levitical family in the most important of the courses of the priests. So, in Jewish history as well, we have people saying, yeah, we can trace our ancestry back 1,000 years. What's the big deal? Our culture doesn't place an emphasis on that. We don't care so much about that. We're very individualistic. They were not. You miss the cultural context if you make this objection thinking that they wouldn't care about it any more than we do. They did. So ignorance of the cultural context of first century Judaism turns out to be the source of the third complaint. Oh, let's move on to another one. The date of Jesus' birth. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king. Well, that seems to make it clear. Herod the king, that can only be King Herod the Great, and it's very plain that it is Herod the Great. But then Luke 2, 1 and 2 says something funny. It says, in those days a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. And then in the English Standard Version, which I'm using, it says, this was the first registration when Quirinius was governor of Syria. So here's the objection. Matthew claims Jesus was born during the reign of Herod the Great. Luke claims that Jesus was born during the census of Quirinius. Herod the Great died in 4 BC. The census of Quirinius was in 6 AD. Jesus' birth was before the death of Herod. So it's got to be, what, at least 10 years, maybe 12 years? How do you make an error that big and then paper it over? Well, first thing we have to do is say, is that what Luke says? So there's several common responses, and in the full set of notes, which Dr. Wielhouwer's got up on the website, I go through 3 of these. But the best one, in my opinion, is that Luke doesn't actually claim that the taxation under Quirinius took place in 6 BC, or that Jesus was born during the taxation of Quirinius in 6 AD. Yes, he does! Yes, he does, says the skeptic. Look, it says this was the first registration when Quirinius was governor of Syria. How much clearer can you get? He didn't become governor of Syria until 86. You've got a chronological blunder. How do you explain that away? Well, first thing to say before we even get into looking at the details, Luke knows that Jesus was born during the reign of Herod the Great. He says so in chapter 1. And Luke knows about the taxation under Quirinius in the year 6 because he quotes a speech of Gamaliel talking about it in the book of Acts. Widely agreed that the book of Acts and the book of Luke are by the same author. Acts is Luke, part 2. So any explanation that we give of what Luke says has to take account of the fact that he knows about both of these things. Okay, now we get into some Greek. The word for registration, in some of your Bibles, that'll just be taxation. What do you have here for the decree that all the world should be, and then does it say registered, enrolled, taxed? What does yours say? This would be Luke 2:1.
In those days a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered.
Should be registered. How many of you have got that? Oh, Bibles? We were supposed to open our Bibles. You got registered also?
Yeah.
Anybody have something different?
I taxed.
You've got taxed. Okay. So what's the deal? Well, the word is apographe, and it means literally a signing up. Here's the deal. To be taxed by the Roman Empire was a 2-stage process. First thing you did was to go in, sign your name, list the members of your household, and sign your allegiance to Caesar. He's your emperor. He's the guy who protects you. The Roman soldiers keep the bandits out of the hills. So there was a signing up, and you listed your property. Then they'd have their auditors go over that. They'd figure out how much to tax you. Second stage in it was the actual giving of money. But by the same figure of speech that you find sometimes in English literature called metonymy, the part is sometimes used for the whole. So the apographe can also mean the taxing, the actual taking of the money, the whole process. So it can mean either the first step in it or the thing of which that's the first step. And the word is used both ways. So even to translate it, you have to make a decision. The word aute, this is a technical Greek point that won't make any difference to those of you who don't know the language. If it's spelled all in capitals, there's an ambiguity as to whether it means this or the registration itself. I think, and I've got some good scholars to back me up on this, it probably does mean itself. So the registration or the taxation itself, now that's a kind of intensifier, it's a stress. That could be read to mean that Quirinius, a decade later, picked up on something that had been left uncompleted and brought it to fruition, finished it up, brought the taxation itself to pass. And the funny thing is, we know that Luke uses the verb there that way in Luke chapter 11. So I've given a reference there. I'm not going to dwell on this, but if you want to ask more questions about it later or dig it up for yourself, do it. Look at the Luke 11. There's a prophecy that's made that there's going to be a famine, and Luke says, and this came to pass. The came to pass there, or happened, is the same verb as this was. This came to pass under Quirinius, the governor of Syria. It's the exact same verb, pretty much the same construction, actually. Now, if we read it this way, then Luke's passing mention of the registration in the time of Judas the Galilean doesn't have to be explained away. That could be when it was actually brought to completion. Luke's reference corresponds to Josephus' comment in his Antiquities of the Jews. He's a Jewish historian writing in the 1st century, so perfect for overlap with the New Testament. He says that there were a group of Pharisees who would not sign an oath of allegiance to Caesar, and so they got fined. And a noble woman, feeling that they had conscientious objections, she paid their fine. Why would a bunch of Pharisees have to sign an oath of allegiance to Caesar? Well, if there was the beginning of a taxation, and then it was cut off, that would make sense. And then we don't have to predate the governorship of Quirinius, so all the apparent chronological problems disappear. That one is probably, just in my judgment, the best one they've got, because that one takes some knowledge. You have to be able to dig into that one and say, okay, what are the words actually saying here? What's really meant? Can I coordinate this with what I know from outside history? But when you do, the problem dissolves. So here's a summary of the objection. I know that went kind of long. Probably loose language means that although the census was aborted in 6 BC, they signed up and then they never took the money. It was picked up and carried through to its logical completion, the taxation itself under Quirinius. Okay, Christmas time, let's do another one here. Matthew 2:1. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, and then you read on a little bit, the wise guys come, right, and going into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother. But in Luke 2:4, and Joseph also went up from Galilee from the town of Nazareth, that's where he's coming from, to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem. So in Matthew, you get no mention of Nazareth, but in Luke, that's where Joseph is coming from, and he's taking Mary with him. So here's the objection stated by a modern enemy of Christianity. Matthew 2:1-12 and 22-23 say Joseph was originally a resident of Bethlehem, whereas Luke 1:26-27 and 56, 2, 4, and 5, etc. say he was a resident of Nazareth. Now, these two towns are several days' journey apart, so that just looks like it can't be right. Is that what Matthew says? Somebody who's got a Bible, tell me, in which chapter of Matthew is Jesus born? Where does it actually say he was born? Look it up. Sword drill time. Come on, people. Speed up.
First of chapter 2? Or is
Can anybody beat that?
Matthew 1:25.
Ooh, what does 125 say? Read it for us.
But he did not consummate their marriage until she gave birth to a son, and he gave him the name Jesus.
Okay, she gave birth to a son and he gave him the name Jesus. That's in chapter 1. Trick question. What town does it say that birth took place in? In chapter 1, it doesn't say. What had they been doing before that? Well, waiting for the baby to come. But, I mean, where were they living? It doesn't say. Read the text for yourself. The first mention of Bethlehem is in the beginning of chapter 2. So the beginning of chapter 2, it says, yeah, Jesus was born in Bethlehem. But that's what Luke says too. So Matthew never says that Joseph and Mary were living in Bethlehem already. The first time Bethlehem is mentioned is in 2, verse 1, as the place where Jesus was born. He doesn't mention a house until the wise men come. He doesn't say Jesus was born in a house. He says he was born in Bethlehem. He doesn't call it the place where Jesus was born. He calls it the place where the child was. Do you see the difference? So it's important to read the text for oneself and not take someone else's word for what it says, particularly because the misreading of these texts is the favorite pastime of people who want to construct large lists of 439 contradictions in the Bible. Don't let them do your reading for you. Take up your own Bible and read. Oh, But aren't we getting off too easy? If Mary and Joseph were living somewhere other than Bethlehem before Jesus was born, why didn't Matthew say so? And what do you think? What do you think the answer should be to that? What's Matthew's purpose? Is it to give us the complete biography of Jesus? No. That's not his purpose. Everybody who writes history has to leave things out. You can think that you've got the most meticulous history of somebody ever written, and I bet you I can think up questions that aren't answered. What was his dog's name? Might get it, might not. How long were his shoelaces? I don't know. Gosh, we select things to write history for a certain purpose, and we leave out other things. None of the Gospels professes to give a complete account. That wasn't their purpose. In fact, if you look at John 20, verse 30, now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. He even advertises the fact that he's not giving you a complete account, even of the miraculous signs Jesus did in the presence of his disciples. He's not going to give you a complete list. He's not trying. Because that's not his purpose. Completeness is not the purpose. So this complaint arises from a misplaced expectation of completeness in the narratives. We're almost halfway there, and these will go more quickly. Here's alleged contradiction 4. Andrew, Philip, and Bartholomew, and Matthew, and Thomas, and James the son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus, that's Mark's list of disciples, and then Luke has, and Judas the son of James, and Judas Iscariot. So there's 2 guys named Judas according to Luke, but there's some dude named Thaddeus in Mark's list. What's going on there? Can you think of any prominent person in the New Testament who has multiple names? Go.
Saul, who changed his name to Paul.
Saul changes his name to Paul. So there's one. Anybody else?
Mark.
Mark, who is also called
John.
John. Good. Anybody else? There's a big one. Peter. And what's he also called?
Simon.
Sorry?
Simon.
Simon. Or sometimes Simon Peter. And what else? Cephas. Remember Jesus giving him that Aramaic name, and that comes up a couple times too. So people do have multiple names. In that time, it was quite common for someone to be known by several different names. We know this from name lists. We know this from other writings. This is not something that we're making up to try to save it. We're trying to be sensitive to the actual cultural context as it was. So it looks like this one Judas, the son of James, and Thaddeus, 2 different names for the same guy. So that arises from a confusion where 2 different names for the same person are mistaken for names of 2 different people. Remember, that was one of our categories of ways to get apparent contradictions in Scripture. So that one's pretty easy, I think, once you recognize that the having of multiple names was very common in those days. Let's move on to number 5. So Matthew 8:5 says, when he entered Capernaum, a centurion came forward to him, appealing to him, and what does he say? My servant is sick. Please heal my servant, all right? Oh, but Luke 7 tells us what looks like the same story. When the centurion heard about Jesus, he sent to him elders of the Jews, asking him to come and heal his servant. Which way is it? Did he go himself? Or did he send some people? What do you think? This is a place where a little bit of cultural context helps us to understand a turn of phrase. In the first century world, it was very common to speak of someone's performing an action when it was by his authority, or by his provision, or by his request that it was done. Right? If I say, the president fought a war. Did the president go out and fight the war by himself? No, he sends other people out, but they're going by his authority, and he is said to be doing the action. Matthew speaks of the action as belonging to the centurion because he initiates it. Luke, in greater detail, informs us that he sent the message by means of others. If you say you're not sure whether that's really just making an excuse for getting out of it, I'm sympathetic. Let's look and see if that comes up in other places as well. So here's Matthew 27, 59 and 60. And Joseph of Arimathea took the body and laid it in his own new tomb, which he had cut in the rock. Which he had cut in the rock. And yet, how is Joseph of Arimathea described? He's a rich man. He doesn't do manual labor. He's not the guy who's down there cutting a tomb out of the rock. He sends other people to do that, and he pays them. But it's said that he had cut the tomb out of the rock because it was done by his authority and by the provision of his funding, and then the tomb belonged to him. That's the way the language is used. You say, well, that's one example. Can I see another? I'm glad you asked. John chapter 4, verses 1 and 2. The Pharisees heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John. And then there's this little parenthetical remark. Although Jesus himself did not baptize, but only his disciples, well then, why is the word going out that Jesus is baptizing? It's because the baptisms are being done by his authority, by his delegation. And therefore, it's an appropriate use of language. This is the way they use language. This actually sheds light on other passages as well. So this and I put one in the long set of notes, which Dr. Wielhouwer has. You'll see I put another passage for you to go look at where there's an apparent conflict, but if you remember that when someone sends someone as a messenger or as an envoy, he's said to be asking himself or doing the deed himself. It all comes clear. So, maybe I didn't put that in those notes, so write this down. Check out Mark 10:35, compare with Matthew 20:20. Same thing is going on here. So this one point actually